Faced with the humiliating defeat in the Lebanon, President Reagan's government was desperate to shore up the vision of a moral world where a good America struggled against evil. And to do this, they were going to create a simple villain, an imaginary enemy, one that would free them from the paralyzing complexity of real Middle Eastern politics. And the perfect candidate was waiting in the wings, Colonel Gaddafi, the ruler of Libya. The Americans were going to ruthlessly use Colonel Gaddafi to create a fake terrorist mastermind. And Gaddafi was going to happily play along, because it would turn him into a famous global figure.
Libya were less downside consequences, if you will. There's less Arab support for Gaddafi. We figured there would be less Soviet support for Gaddafi.
Colonel Gaddafi had taken power in a coup in the 1970s. But from the very start, he was convinced that he was more than just the leader of one country. He believed that he was an international revolutionary, whose destiny was to challenge the power of the West.
Gentlemen, the Queen.
When he was a young officer, Gaddafi had been sent to England for training. And he had detested the patronising racism that he said he had found at the heart of British society.
Yes, I attended a course. I have been in England since 1966, from April to August.
You had the best months.
I was in Beaconsfield, a village called Beaconsfield, in Army School. In fact, we ill-treated in that place from some British officers. I think those officers were Jews.
Once in power, Gaddafi had developed his own revolutionary theory, which he called the Third Universal Theory. It was an alternative, he said, to communism and capitalism. He published it in a green book, but practically no one read it. He had sent money and weapons to the IRA in Ireland to help them overthrow the British ruling class. But all the other Arab leaders rejected him and his ideas. They thought that he was mad. And by the mid-1980s, Gaddafi was an isolated figure, with no friends and no global influence. Then suddenly that changed. In December 1985, terrorists attacked Rome and Vienna airports simultaneously, killing 19 people, including 5 Americans. There was growing pressure on President Reagan to retaliate.
You talk tough. Let's say you use some of these billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of weapons that you've asked us to approve. Your words are cheap talk.
These murderers could not carry out their crimes without the sanctuary and support provided by regimes such as Colonel Gaddafi's in Libya. The Rome and Vienna murders are only the latest in a series of brutal terrorist acts committed with Gaddafi's backing.
But the European security services, who investigated the attacks, were convinced that Libya was not involved at all, and that the mastermind behind the attacks was in fact Syria.
The only evidence we have shows a Syrian connection.
You say that it was Libya, and the president said the evidence of Libya's culpability was irrefutable.
Yeah.
But the Italian authorities to whom I've spoken say emphatically on the record that their investigations have shown that it was entirely masterminded by Syria.
I don't agree with that at all.
Well, they've interrogated the surviving terrorists.
I must just say I don't agree with that.
But you've no evidence that Libya was in on the planning either.
Our evidence on Libya is circumstantial but very strong.
But why does the president then say it's irrefutable if you call it circumstantial?
Well, people can be convicted and sentenced in our courts on circumstantial evidence.
But what made it even more confusing was that although there seemed to be no evidence that Gaddafi had been behind the attacks, he made no attempt to deny the allegations.
This hostile position cannot be explained in racist and crusade terms. Suicidal attacks will have to be an answer to a military attack. But Libya is not affected by such measures that Reagan has declared. Stinking, rotten crusader.
Gaddafi now started to play a role that was going to become very familiar. He grabbed the publicity that had been given to him by the Americans and used it dramatically. He promoted himself as an international revolutionary who would help to liberate oppressed peoples around the world, even the blacks in America.
Brothers and sisters, it is with great honor and privilege that I present to you the leader of the Al-Fatah revolution from Libya, our brother Muammar Gaddafi.
And to express my full support and support of my country to your struggle for freedom, for emancipation.
Gaddafi promised that he would supply weapons to create a black army in America of 400,000 men. If white America refuses to accept blacks as US citizens, he told them, it must therefore be destroyed. Gaddafi also invited a group of German rocket scientists to come to Libya to build him a rocket. He insisted it had no military purpose. Libya was now going to explore outer space.
I think it is peaceful and civilian activity for investigation of space and something like this. And it has nothing to do with any military things.
But no one believed him. Journalists warned that Gaddafi was really preparing to attack Europe, vividly dramatizing the new danger.
That is something like this, which goes that way to put something into space. But the same device, tilted, say, to an angle of 45 degrees, could, of course, become something very different. A missile possibly carrying a warhead. That would put Libya within range of an enormous area. A chilling proposition with its range of 2,000 kilometers.
The Americans and Gaddafi now became locked together in a cycle of mutual reinforcement. In the process, a powerful new image was created that was going to capture the imagination of the West. Gaddafi became a global supervillain, at the head of what was called a rogue state. A madman who threatened the stability of the world. And Gaddafi was loving every minute of it.
Does he think in the past his decisions sometimes have been taken too quickly?
Maybe.
On world affairs?
Maybe.
I think sometimes that is what has made people in the world nervous of you, perhaps.
Maybe.
Then there was another terrorist attack at a discotheque in West Berlin. In April 1986, the Americans attacked Libya. Their targets included Colonel Gaddafi's own house. Immediately after the attack, Gaddafi appeared in the ruins to describe what had happened.
The family were asleep, and my wife was, that day, tied down to the bed because she had a slip disc. I tried to rescue the children, and the house started to collapse, as you can see, and the books started to burn. They concentrated on the children's room so that they would kill all the children.
Gaddafi realised that the attention of the whole world was now focused on him, and he grabbed the moment to promote his own revolutionary theory, the Third Way, as a global alternative to democracy.
I feel that I am really responsible for conveying the Third World Theory and the Green Book to the rising generation, to the young American and British people, so that we can rescue America and Britain and these generations of young people from this theory this electoral party theory, which enabled an imbecile like Reagan to rule the mightiest power on earth.
Wow, look at that. What the heck is that? Oh my God, look at that.
In the 1980s, more and more people in the United States reported seeing unexplained objects and lights in the sky. At the same time, investigators who believed in UFOs revealed that they had discovered top-secret government documents that stated that alien craft had visited Earth. But actually, the reality was even stranger. The American government might have been making it all up, that they had created a fake conspiracy to deliberately mislead the population. The lights that people imagined were UFOs may in reality have been new high-technology weapons that the US government were testing. The government had developed the weapons because they, in turn, imagined that the Soviet Union was far stronger than it was, and still wanted to conquer the world. The government wanted to keep the weapons secret, but they couldn't always hide their appearance in the skies. So it is alleged that they chose a number of people to use to spread the rumour that these were really alien visitations. What the Reagan administration were doing, both with Colonel Gaddafi and with the UFOs, was a blurring of fact and fiction. But it was part of an even broader programme. The President's advisors had given it a name. They called it perception management, and it became a central part of the American government during the 1980s. The aim was to tell dramatic stories that grabbed the public imagination, not just about the Middle East, but about Central America and the Soviet Union. And it didn't matter if the stories were true or not, providing they distracted people, and you, the politician, from having to deal with the intractable complexities of the real world.
Reality became less and less of an important factor in American politics. It wasn't what was real that was driving anything, or the facts driving anything. It was how you could turn those facts, or twist the facts, or even make up the facts to make your opponent look bad. So perception management became a device, and the facts could be twisted. Anything could be anything.
President Assad didn't want stability. He wanted revenge. In December 1988, a bomb exploded on a Pan Am plane over Lockerbie in Scotland. Almost immediately, investigators and journalists pointed the finger at Syria. The bombing had been done, they said, in revenge for the Americans shooting down of an Iranian airliner in the Gulf a few months before. And for 18 months, everyone agreed that this was the truth. But then, a strange thing happened. The security agencies said that they had been wrong. It hadn't been Syria at all. It was Libya who had been behind the Lockerbie bombing. But many journalists and politicians did not believe it. They were convinced that the switch had happened for the most cynical of reasons. That America and Britain desperately needed Assad as an ally in the coming Gulf War against Saddam Hussein. So once again, they blamed Colonel Gaddafi as the terrorist mastermind.
Well, Well, Syria, of course, was unfortunately accused of many terrorist outrage and of harbouring terrorist groups. It appears that we have now restored relations with them, as have the Americans. They're now our friends, although we get no real assurances on the past whatsoever. It strikes me as very strange indeed that many of the things we thought were previously the responsibility of Syria have now dramatically become the responsibility of Libya.
20 years before, President Reagan had been confronted by the first suicide bombers. They had been unleashed by President Assad of Syria to force America out of the Middle East. But rather than confront the complexity of Syria and Israel and the Palestinian problem, America had retreated and left Syria and suicide bombing to fester and mutate. They had gone instead for Colonel Gaddafi and turned him into an evil global terrorist. But in the process, this changed the way people saw and understood terrorism. Instead of a violence born out of political struggles for power, it became replaced by a much simpler image of an evil tyrant at the head of a rogue state, who became more like an arch-criminal who wanted to terrorize the world.
We counted at least 6 separate explosions.
Tony Blair and George Bush were faced by disaster. Iraq was imploding, while at home they were being accused of lying to their own people to justify the invasion. What they desperately needed was something that would show that the invasion was having a good effect in the Arab world. So they made an extraordinary decision. And instead, they set out to make him their new best friend. It was going to be the highest achievement of perception management. A man who had been created by the West as a fake global supervillain was now going to be turned into a fake hero of democracy. And everyone, not just politicians, would become involved. Public relations, academics, television presenters, spies, and even musicians were all going to help reinvent Colonel Gaddafi. It would show just how many people in the Western establishment had by now become the engineers of this fake world. Ever since he had been accused of the Lockerbie bombing, Colonel Gaddafi had been a complete outcast. The West had imposed sanctions on Libya, and the economy was falling apart. But then suddenly, Tony Blair broke live into the BBC Evening News.
The Prime Minister, Tony Blair, is about to make a statement the BBC understands from Downing Street. It's of international significance. He'll be making his statement at any moment. Now we can see pictures of him in Durham City. Here he is.
Colonel Gaddafi has confirmed that Libya has in the past sought to develop weapons of mass destruction capabilities. Libya has now declared its intention to dismantle its weapons of mass destruction completely. This decision by Colonel Gaddafi is an historic one and a courageous one, and I applaud it.
Today in Tripoli, the leader of Libya, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, publicly confirmed his commitment to disclose and dismantle all weapons of mass destruction programs in his country.
Colonel Gaddafi now became for Western politicians a heroic figure. His decision to give up his weapons of mass destruction seemed to prove that the invasion of Iraq could transform the Middle East. And Tony Blair travelled to meet Gaddafi in his desert tent, to welcome him back into what one journalist called the community of civilized nations. But as in the past, nothing was what it seemed with Colonel Gaddafi. In reality, Gaddafi did not really have the terrifying weapons of mass destruction that he was promising to destroy. His nuclear program had stuttered to a halt long ago and never produced anything dangerous. He had managed to buy some equipment on the black market, but his technicians had been unable to assemble it. His biological weapons were non-existent. All he had was some old mustard gas in leaking barrels. But now, he had to pretend to have a terrifying arsenal of weapons, and the West had to pretend that they had avoided another global threat. And then the made-up stories became even more complicated. As part of the deal, the West said that if Gaddafi admitted that Libya had done the Lockerbie bombing, then they would lift the sanctions. But many of those who had investigated Lockerbie were still convinced that Libya hadn't done it, that really it had been Syria. But Colonel Gaddafi confessed. His son Saif was interviewed about this confession. He said that his father was simply pretending that he had been behind the Lockerbie bombing to get the sanctions lifted, that new lies were being built on top of old lies to construct a completely make-believe world.
You have to accept, or you had to accept at that time, the responsibility, because you have to accept responsibilities, you have to pay compensation in order to get rid of the sanction. It means we did that not because we are convinced that we did it, but because to find an exit out of this nightmare.
So what you're saying is that you accept responsibility, but you're not admitting that you did it?
Yes.
And this is all a sham, you're saying, just to get sanctions over with so that you can start normal diplomatic relations with the West?
Okay. What's wrong with that?
It's a very cynical way to behave as a country, isn't it? Many people would say.
First of all, I mean, the Americans in the British, they told us to write that letter. They told us to pay compensation. And then they opened their embassies and they restored the relation and they came to us. It was their game, not our game.
Muammar Gaddafi. And then Colonel Gaddafi achieved his lifelong dream. He was invited to address the United Nations. He spent almost 2 hours explaining his third universal theory, and also demanded an investigation into the shootings of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King. When he was in New York, Gaddafi was offered a tent, just like the one he had at home, in the gardens of a grand mansion. The man who made the offer was Donald Trump.
I mean, I've dealt with everybody. Right. And by the way, I could tell you something else. What? I dealt with Gaddafi. What did I do with Gaddafi? You buried the lead. What'd you do? Excuse me. I rented him a piece of land. He paid me more for one night than the land was worth for the whole year or for 2 years. And then I didn't let him use the land. That's what we should be doing. Was that over in New Jersey? I don't want to use the word screw, but I screwed him. That's what we should be doing.
Then, almost immediately, the Arab Spring began. Many of the political leaders of the West also enthusiastically supported the revolutions, because it seemed to fit with their simple idea of regime change. It might have failed in Iraq, but now the people everywhere were rising up to rid themselves of the evil tyrants, and democracy would flourish. So when an uprising began in Libya, Britain, France and America supported it. And suddenly, Colonel Gaddafi stopped being a hero of the West. All the politicians and the public relations people and the academics who had all promoted him as a global thinker suddenly disappeared. And Gaddafi became yet again an evil dictator who had to be overthrown. His son Saif said, "The way these people are disowning me and my father is disgusting. Just a few months ago, we were being treated as honoured friends. Now that rebels are threatening our country, these cowards are turning on us."